Good morning. Today we're going to be starting the new unit, which actually would have been what we would have started just after March break. Um, the unit is finance, and it actually just continues on from what we were doing just before the March break. It's going to start a little bit different, but it's going to soon fall back into what we call exponential relationships, and that's what we were doing before we left. So, our first example is going to be an example of what we call simple interest. Now, I'm introducing this unit with an example to give you an idea as the type of questions you'll be asked to answer. So it says you invest $100 into an account that gives 10% simple interest per year. How does your money grow? Well, the first thing we need to discuss is, what do I mean by simple interest? Simple interest is interest that is paid or charged based on the original amount invested or borrowed. So oftentimes there are going to be two different scenarios in finance. Either you're going to be investing money or you're going to be borrowing money. And interest basically works the same way for both. Now, just to start us off on the same foot, what actually is interest? Well, interest is an amount of money that the bank is going to give you, or the investment is going to give you, based on how much you actually lend or borrow, invest or borrow from them. So let's just talk about investment for now, just to keep things simpler. If you invest money in the bank doesn't leave the money in the vault until you come back to take it out again. The bank actually invests your money, and they invest all over the world, and they make a certain amount of money back from those investments. So let's say the bank invests in a whole bunch of companies, and those companies do very, very well, and those companies pay the bank a certain amount of money based on how much they made. The bank then takes that extra money that they just made, their interest, and gives you a very, very, very small amount of that interest. So basically, you're getting free money. The interest is free money that the bank is giving you because they made money from the money you gave them. Okay? So that's basically what interest is. It's just extra money being made by extra companies, and then you getting a small amount of that money. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at a table of values. It's always a good idea to look at a pattern in a table of values to try to understand what's going on. And in this table of values, I have the time in years as the X column, and I have the amount in the bank as the Y column. And as you can see from the example above, we invested $100, right? And we're making 10% interest on that $100. So how do you calculate interest? Interest is a percentage. So if I want to calculate the interest, I'm going to do that off to the side here. I'm going to take my $100 and I'm going to multiply it by 10%. I'm going to write the 10% up here because you can't, in a mathematical equation, technically write a percentage in an equation, okay? You have to convert it into a decimal. We've seen scenarios like this before. So to convert a number into a decimal value, when you're talking about a percentage, what you do is you divide by 100. Okay? When you divide by 100, it moves the decimal place from where it is right after the 0 here, 2 spaces to the left. So you're going to get 0.10. So that's what we're multiplying 100 by, which is 0.10. Now, I chose numbers that were pretty easy to work with here. What's interesting is when you multiply 100 times 0.10, you just get $10. All right? So you invested $100 in the bank, and at the end of 1 year, you now have $110 because we have to take our $100 plus the $10 interest that we got and add them together. Okay? So here's where simple interest differs from interest that you're probably used to seeing in the bank. There are two different types of interest, and we're going to talk about the second type later. The second type is called compound interest. Now, in simple interest, when I calculate the interest for the second year, I don't take into account that I made $10 in the first year. I just go back to my initial amount and multiply by 0.10 again. Well, that's always going to give us the same $10. So now, to find my amount in the second year, I take the $110 that I now have in my first year, but I only add $10 again, which gives me 120. And following this pattern, I'm just adding $10 each time. Okay? I'm not going to fill in the entire table here, but you're just adding you're just taking $100 each time, multiplying it by 0.10, and therefore adding $10 each time. And that means if we do our first differences, we're going to get 10 all the way up. And if our first differences are the same, what kind of relationship does that give us? And from grade 9 and 10, when your first differences are the same, that means that the relationship is linear. So if we were actually to graph this scenario, we'd be starting at 100, and we'd be going up at a rate of $10 every year, and this would be a straight line. Okay? I'm making my line worse and worse. Let's try that again. That's as straight as I can get it, folks. Okay? So that would be a straight line. The slope would be 10. And that's how simple interest works. Okay? Now, because we keep multiplying by the same amount in the table each row, there's an equation that models this scenario. And that's what we're going to look at next. Now, before we look at the equation, there's a couple of terms you need to know in finance. Okay? The variables and the terms we use, the first one you usually talk about is what we call the principal. Okay? Now, the principal is the amount of money that you originally invested or borrowed. So in our previous example, that amount would be $100. The rate of interest, R, is the interest rate as a percentage. In our example above, that was 10%. And then we have time, which is T, which is self-explanatory. So what are the formulas that we're going to need to use for finance? Well, here's the formula to calculate the interest. Okay, that's an I. I'm actually going to fill that in because I know it might look like a 1 or an L. Couldn't get that style of I to show up. Interest is equal to the principal times the rate times the time. Okay, this is going to allow us to calculate any one of the rows in the above column. And let's say I wanted to know how much money I'd have after 20 years. Well, if I go back to that table for a second, if you wanted to know how much money you had after 20 years, you'd have to extend this table all the way up to 20. But you don't need to do that if you know the formula. The formula will take care of that for us. Now, once we've calculated the interest, which is PRT, to calculate the final amount, we just add what our original amount was, which is our principal, plus the interest, which is PRT. So we just add those two together. And that's what I was doing in the table here when I added the, when I added the 100 plus the 10, I was adding our principal plus our interest. And our interest was multiplied here. Okay? Now, in this case, you might be wondering, so this is PR, where's the T? Well, we're talking about 1 year intervals here, so the T was always 1. All right? But I was adding the previous value to the new value, to the interest to get the new value. So this was taking care of the PRT for us. But now we don't want to use the table anymore. We just want to use the formula. So that's all going to be taken care of in the formula here. Okay? So depending on the question, sometimes they'll ask you to calculate the interest first and then the final amount. sometimes they'll ask you just to calculate the final amount. You can always calculate I first separately and then just add it to the P to find your final amount. So let's look at some examples. So we're going to go back to the original example. Hold on a second, I think I made a mistake. Yeah, this was supposed to say for 20 years, folks. Okay, you can see in my part B here, I just forgot to mention that you needed to know that for the first part. So how much interest will you have made on an investment of $100 at 10% interest, simple interest per year, if you invested for 20 years? Okay, so the first question says, how much interest will you have made? Well, if I'm asking you to calculate interest, I'm asking you to use the I is equal to PRT formula. Okay, so our principal is 100. Now R, I always want you to calculate R separately, folks, because you need to get used to converting it into a decimal. Okay, so you always divide by 100 to go from a percentage to a decimal. All right, and this right here is one of the biggest mistakes I'll always see students make, so please don't be that person. All right, anytime you see a percentage, always write it as a decimal. Okay, so 0.10 is our rate, and our time of 20 goes here, and this is going to take care of the fact that we don't need to do a table of values that goes all the way up to 20 anymore. So we know that 100 times, without using a calculator here, 100 times 0.10 is just 10. 10 times 20 is $200. So you're going to make $200 in 20 years just by putting that $100 in the bank and walking away for 20 years. So how much will you have in total after 20 years? Well, this is our second equation. A is equal to P plus PRT. Well, our principal was $100. We made $200 in interest. That means we now have $300 in the bank instead of our original $100. Okay? So after 20 years, you'll have made $200 in interest, and you're going to have $300 in the bank. Now, these were easy numbers to work with, folks. Finding an account that gives 10% interest is very difficult to do unless you're investing in mutual funds or stocks and bonds. And at that point, you actually won't be using simple interest anyway. You'd be using compound interest. But just to get us started, I wanted to use an easy example here. It might not be a realistic example, but I just wanted to use nice numbers to work with. So that's basically how that works. And just to recap, when you're calculating your interest, you use PRT. When you're calculating your final amount, you add your interest to your original principal to find out what your final amount was. So here's a more realistic example. And in this case, this is going to be money that you're borrowing, basically, okay? Because it says you buy a $12,000 car, and the dealership offers to finance the car at 2% interest for 3 years. And this is a simple interest scenario. Okay, I probably should have mentioned that here. So we're going to calculate a couple of things here. The first thing we're going to do is calculate how much interest you're going to owe on that car. Now, you do have to pay taxes on that car as well, but we're going to say that the interest isn't paid on the taxes. So you're not actually having to pay interest on your taxes, which would kind of not be very fair. Okay, so let's just calculate how much interest you would owe. So we know that interest is equal to PRT. And I'm going to calculate my rate over here again. So 2%. 2% is equal to what decimal? Well, if you divide this by 100, you're moving the decimal place 2 spots to the left, which gives 0.02. Okay? So let's put in all our numbers. P is 12,000, our principal. R is 0.02. and t is 3. Now for this one, I'm going to need a calculator. So let's switch over to the calculator here. So we've got 12,000 times 0.02 times 3. So that equals $720. Okay, so in interest alone, you're going to have to pay $720 on that car. Now let's calculate the tax on a car. Now, I'm actually not a finance person, so I'm assuming that you have to pay the full 13% tax on the car. Tax is it's 13%. I was doing the decimal version first there. We need to convert that to a decimal, which is 0.13. So to calculate our tax, so our final tax, we're going to take $12,000 and multiply it by 0.13. Now again, I'm going to go to a calculator. Let's clear this number out. So we've got $12,000 times 0.13, which gives $1,560. So let's transition back to the smartboard here. So $1,560. So that's our tax amount. Okay. So our interest is $720. Our tax amount is $1,560. Calculate the final amount with taxes that you'll have to pay for this car. So car amount is equal to 12,000 plus our interest, which is 720, plus our taxes, which is 1,560. Now I have simplified this example a little bit because there are other fees. There's licensing fees, there's all kinds of different fees for cars. Okay, I'm just talking about the main two extra fees here. So let's add all this up. I'm going to do this off screen. Okay, so 12,000 plus 720 plus 1,560 is equal to 14,280. So that $12,000 car, just talking about interest and taxes, is going to cost $14,280. So one other thing that you often have to do when you're calculating car price is they'll often, and I think we had said this in the original question, that they were doing this for a 3-year period. Okay, now you don't have to pay that price outright. If you can, that's great. But if they give you 3 years to pay, you usually have to pay in either what we call monthly payments or bi-weekly payments. Okay, so bi-weekly means every 2 weeks, monthly means every month. If we have to pay monthly, what would we do to calculate how much per month we'd have to pay off this debt? Well, the first thing we'd have to do is figure out how many months are there in 3 years. Okay, well, we know that there's 12 months a year. So in 3 years, we have 3 times 12, which is 36 months. In fact, a lot of times when you look at commercials for vehicles, they'll actually tell you it's a 36-month loan or something like that, telling you how many months you have to pay it off. Okay, so we're just multiplying the number of years times the number of months, and that tells us how many payments we're going to have to do. Well, I have to break this number, this total, down by how many payments each month. So that means I'm going to be dividing by 36. So if I take 14,280 and divide by 36, that's going to give me how much I have to pay per month for this car. And that would be, I'm just going to do this off screen again. That gives $397 if we round it off. So this car, if you have a 3-year loan, is going to cost you $397 per month. You can get higher lengths of time for loans, but that means you're also going to be paying more interest. So if you had a 5-year loan, we'd have to go back and calculate the interest for 5 years. It might lower this number down a little bit, but you are going to be paying more interest overall. Okay? So with those two examples, you should have enough to be able to answer any of the questions in the homework that I'm going to attach to the Google Classroom. So if you have any questions while you're doing the homework, please don't hesitate to email me and ask me for help. We can always go online and discuss this together if we need to. But I hope with these examples that you'll be okay with most of the questions in the homework for tonight. So take a look at the Google Classroom, and we will talk to you at the next lesson.